How's it going, everyone? It's me, Vivi, and welcome to another Ratchet & Clank related video. Now, I don't know if you guys saw my previous video where I talked about the future of the series a bit. In that video, I did say I would make a separate video talking a bit more about David Bergeaud. Now, I thought of making this video not on my own. When it comes to the technical aspect of things, I thought of this person called JP8K to be the perfect person to be featured in this video. JP8K, present yourself.
Hey guys, what is up? I'm JP8K. I make music on SoundCloud and I do streams on YouTube. All I gotta say, VT and Vivi, is thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
No problem. Now, how do we meet? Long story short, I will try not to ramble. Quick. I was watching a video of Crystal Fisher and JP8K interviewing Josh Mansell, who was the composer of Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter, if I'm not mistaken. Now, JP8K, I think you said you were watching my videos at one point?
Yes, I have. I was watching way before that, but you sort of met me through the whole interview thing.
Comments,
so, yeah.
Comments, DMs, and pretty much all that kind of stuff. So
pretty much that, yeah.
Guys, by the way, there are going to be some technical parts in this video, alright? So the way we're going to go at this is I'm going to bring up a few questions and go over a few points, and we'll see how things go. So let's get started. How did David Bergeaud come up with the music style of Ratchet & Clank? What exactly inspired him? How was he actually approached? I don't know if that was explained in one of the fan interviews. I did watch a couple, and from what I've been listening to, he was good friends with Ted Price. Do you have something to add, JP8K? I know that you've spoken to David Bergeaud personally a lot.
Well, let's begin with the first question you asked, which is how did David Bergeaud come up with the style everyone knows and loves for Ratchet & Clank? Well, the first thing he did was he took sort of like this 70s sort of sci-fi analog synths, like, you know, Kraftwerk or Jean McJar or I can't pronounce his name, I'm sorry, I'm not French. Or, you know, if you know the movie Clockwork Orange, Wendy Carlos, etc., etc. And he took that sound and then he took traditional Hollywood scoring like John Williams or, you know, stuff that you hear in movies, and then mixed that with what was hot in 2002 in the 90s, which was like breakbeat, you know, big beat, IDM, down tempo, pretty much, you know, electronica genre. And he mixed that all together. And that's how the Ratchet & Clank sound was born. And throughout this whole video, I'm going to explain how that sound evolves into what it is today, the rise and downfall. Now, going back to what you said about David being good friends with Ted, yes, that is very true. And he's actually been very vocal about it. Even in the Crystal Fisher podcast I did with Crystal Fisher a while back.
So, JP8K, that's a lot of cool info. Now, how was Bergeaud first approached? As I said before, you were in contact with him a lot. And I think you made a paper on him once, you told me?
Yes, I had to do a college paper on him for audio production, just a class in school. But yes, anyways, yes, he was approached because of, in 1993, he scored Jurassic Park, which was, of course, a big production. He scored the music for the trailer. And 3 years later, he was asked to do Disruptor by Insomniac, which was Insomniac's first game. And by that point, David Bergeaud had become the first Hollywood composer to work on a video game. So I'm not 100% sure how exactly he was approached, but I believe he came across Ted Price at one point, maybe some agency that hooked him up with a job. It's very hard to tell, you know, composers, because it's all client work. You know, you get asked to do something.
Exactly. Since he was good friends with Ted Price, we can all assume that Ted probably saw his work and told him, hey, do you want to compose for Ratchet & Clank, right?
Yes, right. I believe so.
Now, the technical aspect of things, what kinds of electronic instrumentation did he use? Do you have like a list of examples you want to show? Maybe a production method he used?
Yes, I do. And for Ratchet & Clank in particular, like the first game, when that game came out, computer CPUs weren't that powerful yet. So everything for that game was done using hardware. And what I mean by hardware is stuff which I'll have Vivi put on screen for you guys listening. It's stuff like the Proteus 2000, Axis Virus B, Nordlead 2, ATC1, EMU B3, just a bunch of different kinds of hardware. As the series went on, of course, technology was getting more advanced, CPUs were getting faster. So for instance, Going Commando utilized VSTs as well as hardware. And then after a while, it just became mostly VSTs and a little bit of hardware. And VSTs, if you're not familiar, are virtual instruments, and they're instruments that run on a computer. So instead of having something like a hardware module, you have a VST that does the same thing.
Now you guys might be wondering, Vivi, do you understand any of these equipments? Well, not exactly, to be honest. This is the first time I actually hear these names, which is pretty interesting, I have to admit. Now, when Bergeaud composed music, from what I've been hearing from the fan interviews, he said he didn't really play the games. Back then, we didn't have capture cards, right? So they would send him footage in like cassettes, I think? They would send him footage and he would watch the whole gameplay and compose music just like that. I did watch one of the live streams and Ted Price was on one of those live streams. They did explain that. Now JP8K, I've been listening to some of your work and it's awesome. Do you want to share a bit?
Yeah, I mean, those who are listening, I definitely recommend checking out my Ratchet Clank concept EP. I got a lot of cool, like, Ratchet Clank sounding stuff. You know, using pretty much the same equipment that David would have used back in the day. So, but yeah, definitely. And to answer your question, David used a lot of concept art as well as footage. I mean, he didn't play the games. John Williams, for instance, he scored Star Wars. He's never seen a Star Wars movie ever.
Now, the second point I wanted to bring out, the music style of Ratchet & Clank, the PS2 Saga. What did each game bring to the table? Like the first game you told me is more atmospheric. As for the second and third, going Commando up your arsenal, it had a mix of atmosphere and action, right?
Well, yes, the second game is atmosphere and action. The third game is mainly just action, so on and so forth, yes.
Now there's a bit of a small jump, right? Atmosphere to more action. With that in mind, what game was Bergeaud's favorite, you guys might ask? Watching the fan interviews, he said he's the first one is very nostalgic to him. And I understand why, that was his very first project. And then when they moved on to the Future Saga, which we'll get more into detail afterwards, he said all the work he's done up until Quest for Booty is like a sum of all of their past. Like what they've learned, well, what he's learned, he's applied to all of the games that came afterwards. And the Future Saga, there's a bit of a mix. We'll get more into that, as I said, afterwards. What do you think he means by sum of all their past?
Some of all their past. What do you mean exactly by that?
Because he said when he was talking about Tools of Destruction a bit, the style of music, he said, what I've learned...
Oh, Ratchet & Clank 1 was mainly just breakbeats and, you know, electronica driven. Very little orchestration. It had orchestration, but it was more platforming and bouncy and, you know, atmospheric. The second game came out, it was a lot more action-packed. It was still atmospheric. It introduced more a heavier usage of strings and brass, as well as some, like I said, more like of a drum and bass element, more of, you know, in your face. And then the third game was completely action-packed. Like there was a lot more like superhero sort of stuff. Like you had the introduction to guitars in the series. You had stuff like more intense synthesizers, stuff like really, really dirty synth leads. And then transition a year later to 2005, from 2004, of course. And David, a lot of people say that Deadlocked was in SoundMax's decision to go for this more like rocky sort of industrial electronica soundtrack.
Fun fact, Ted Price had said, Deadlocked was like inspired by Halo and GTA. Do you think that inspired Bergeaud to make music like that for Deadlocked?
I think you just saw Deadlocked as a far more gritty game. It was a much more gritty and darker toned game. So the more of the rock, sort of that rock and dirty industrial, like the Axis Spires B is fantastic at making this sort of dirty kind of sound. And you can hear it a lot in there. But Niels by Nelson, who's collaborated on pretty much most of David's work, from Going Commando onward, he was out of town. Now, he's a fantastic guitarist. So David wanted to scale up on his guitar, so he said, why not do Deadlock? And he did all the guitar parts. Ironically, there's not as much guitar in there as you would think. It's mainly just synths and samples.
Alright, nice. Now, I brought up the Future Saga, we'll talk about it more later, alright? Now, the games after Ratchet & Clank 1, Bergeaud explained that it brought more of a challenge. Now, do you think these new elements which he brought to Going Commando up your arsenal, do you think it made it harder or was it more simple?
Elements that he brought in? No, it's just sort of like he made the style and then he just evolved it every year. He added something new to each game. I mean, even Deadlocked has blood of Ratchet & Clank 1, has blood of Ratchet & Clank 2 and 3. it's there, and it's in all of David's work, and you can tell it's a carryover. Even in Tools of Destruction, which is a lot more orchestral than it is electronic, you can still feel that Ratchet and Clank 1 sound is there. It's just highly evolved. Oh, by the way, I wanted to bring up a point quickly, and I want you to link it in the video. I'll show it to you. There's this guy who makes amazing demos on YouTube for the Axis Virus B, and a lot of these demos sound just like Deadlocked. So if you're really interested in that kind of music, check it out. His channel is called Axis Virus B.
All right, I'll leave the link in the description. I won't forget. So Bergeaud also composed for Resistance and Disruptor, as you pointed out previously. Bergeaud, now a lot of people say, now I'm not going to talk too much about the community right now, we'll talk about it later. Bergeaud loves variety. You've listened to music of Ratchet and Clank, the PS2 Saga, for example. A lot of people believe that's ultimately what Bergeaud does, but no, he does love doing variety. As I said before, I did watch a bunch of interviews, and the guy has a lot of talent. If they ever tell him to, hey, produce this and that, he would do it. But anyways, we'll get into that later. Now, did this new music, this new variety to Ratchet and Clank, like going commando, as you mentioned previously, the heavier strings and brass, do you think it took him less time to produce? Is this like related to any kind of hardware or software related type of...
Well, yes, definitely. I mean, I wouldn't say it was easier to produce, but we're talking the difference between 2002. VSTs were really just introduced around 2002, and despite what I just said, yes, actually Ratchet and Clank 1 did use a couple VSTs, but they're very just basic, bare bones kind of stuff. I mean, he might have just used, like I said, not even a VST, but actually just samples, because I do know that he used, if any of you do make music, you might know Spectrasonics. They've did the samples for Spyro and a bunch of other games, Jack and Daxter. I'm not going to get into that, but I think by the time Going Commando came around, it was easier to make strings. It was easier to make these full strings and brass and actual orchestra. Ratchet and Clank's music, it never used a real orchestra. It was always done using samplers.
So, to sum it up, did it bring any advantages or disadvantages using both hardware and software? Do you think hardware brought something more to the table? Or was it more difficult? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Hardware is a lot more difficult because there's a lot more things to do. I mean, David would set up like hundreds of instruments in a single project and have them set up for each game. That's why each soundtrack in each game has a very similar sound to it, because basically you just set up, like I said, a few hundred instruments, and that would be the cake.
You said something the other day, him using spoons or his car or something like that to produce sound?
Well, yeah, David is back then, of course, was a big fan of the whole electronica scene, you know. Yeah. He'd come to America and gone to college for jazz and contemporary electronic music, so he got himself a sampler and he's just started sampling everything. You know, the world's opened up. So he would take like silverware, just different household items and instruments, and just run them through the sampler and see what he could create. And then, like, at one point, he actually took apart his whole entire car and sampled it.
What? That is fascinating.
Yeah, I know. Very awesome.
Now, the third point, the feel of the Future Saga. Like the transition from more electronic-driven soundtracks to a more, what you call it, space opera fairy tale. A lot of people said it sounds a lot more orchestral. Let's talk about that.
Well, the whole idea of making Ratchet and Clank orchestrated was not Insomniac's decision. That was actually David's decision because of, 2007. Of course, David had just scored Resistance, which was a very orchestral soundtrack, the year prior. And, by the time 2006 hit, these things called sample libraries, if you've ever heard of a thing called Native Instruments Contact, they were getting more popular. The ability to have like an actual orchestra without having an actual orchestra. The music of Tools of Destruction was done once again, which is samplers. But we'll talk about it in a moment. But basically, David wanted to go for more of an orchestral sound because of the visuals of Ratchet and Clank Tools of Destruction were a lot more lifelike, realistic for the time period. I mean, the game was classed as one of the truly first Pixar experience kind of games. If you actually says it on the box in North America.
So it's not necessarily a matter of, the industry got more, realistic, so Bergeaud was obliged to compose music more orchestral. It was more of him watching the Future Saga and telling himself, this looks a bit more realistic, so let's go with that.
David still, even though people call, Ratchet and Clank Tools of Destruction is a completely orchestral soundtrack, there's still a lot of electronica elements put in there. And you have to listen around to it, but you can hear it It's there. It's just pushed to the back because the orchestra is now the centerpiece of attention. I personally love the music of Tools Destruction. A lot of people dislike on it because it's very different from David's other work. I mean, to be honest here, David also scored Size Matters and Secret Agent Clank. Now, Size Matters had more of the traditional Ratchet and Clank sound, you know, that typical synthesizers, fantastic soundtrack. It also mixes in some stuff from Tools Destruction. But then you listen to Secret Agent Clank, which came out a year later in 2008. And that, once again, it still had that like electronica-driven thing, but it was mainly orchestral. There's a lot more orchestral elements in there. It felt like a weird mix between Ratchet and Clank, Up Your Arsenal, and Going Commando, mixed with a lot of Tools Destruction. So it wasn't necessarily that it couldn't have made like an electronica soundtrack for Tools Destruction. It's just that Tools Destruction was a very cinematic game, so I decided, cinematic music, why not? I have the capability to do it now. It's very easy. I just use the libraries.
Now, I agree with something you said. Some of the old elements are still present, and one great example of this is Metropolis of Tools of Destruction. I mean, come on, that's one fantastic soundtrack, right? I know you love that one.
Oh, I love it. It's fantastic. Exactly. If you hear, there's like this low bass that plays, that is the ATC. I'll have VV show a picture of it. The ATC, which I mentioned before, is actually an analog bass module that was used on all of the Ratchet and Clank games. That is the bass of Ratchet and Clank. That is what the low end is.
The music of Tools, what did he use? Did he use like both hardware and software, or only software? Because I do see some people composing, like orchestrating some soundtracks and only using software. Is he using both?
He's still using both there.
Oh.
Definitely for the orchestra was definitely software, but for like I said, the ATC bass, you can't just make that with software or, you know.
Now, again, I'm gonna bring up a fan interview, this one was like 16 minutes. Bergeaud said something about Ratchet and Clank 1 not necessarily scoring music for it. He said that Ted Price and him agreed on making the music more loopy. What does he mean by loopy?
Right, so what he means by loopy is the production of the music is devised by making just multi-track recordings and looping them. Or like, for instance, like, let's take a guitar, for instance. You could write a guitar riff, and then you could write a breakbeat and put the breakbeat underneath the guitar riff, and then you have maybe some weird synthesizer lead that goes along with it. And then you have a bass underneath of that, and then you just loop that over and over again, and write different parts to it and introduce it. And it comes together like building blocks. And I'll actually have VT and VV show like a picture of what I'm talking about. If you ever use like a program like FL Studio or Bitwig, Logic, Ableton Live, these are all DAWs, or also known as digital audio workstations. And yeah, that's the process. Versus something like a scored game would be pretty much recorded all together. Like, let's say you record an orchestra, you would record the whole entire orchestra at once, for the most part.
Now, since you're familiar with these things, how long does it take you to compose? Just quick.
Depends on the track. It really depends on the track. Like, there's been tracks I can get done within like 30 minutes, 4 hours, day, 2 days, week. Depends on, you know, how complex I want it, time I have available. I mean, I live on my computer and just make music. Like I said, I definitely recommend checking out my SoundCloud. I got a lot of good stuff. I just released an EP called Distorted Reality, and it's a very interesting journey of a track. It's 4 pieces of music combined into one. I'll have VV link that below.
For sure. Now, the other day you spoke to me and told me, hey, dude, listen to Metropolis from the first game and Metropolis from Up Your Arsenal. You told me I'm not an expert, but the way I summarize things is there's a lot more, what's the word you used? Brass bass in the back for Up Your Arsenal?
Right, so comparison, if you listen to the first Metropolis, which of course was in monophonic, it was mixed down to monophonic for the game, it's a lot more just not much in your face. It's very atmospheric, pushed back. It's in a way, it's not in your face. Versus when you listen to the Metropolis theme that's in Up Your Arsenal, it's very much in your face. It's very action based. There's a lot more bass. There's a lot more weird, powerful synths. I mentioned dirty synthesizers and stuff that are just like making the track so much louder and more just action packed. And that's due to the fact that, like I said, Ratchet & Clank 1 was an atmospheric game, and Ratchet & Clank 3 was more of a action-driven game.
Now, on to the next point. Bergeaud, he composed for Quest for Booty. That was his last project, which was in 2008. What was the influence of the pirate theme?
One of the tracks sounds just like Pirates of the Caribbean theme.
Yes.
Straight up. So I'm pretty sure that David took a lot of influences from just that. I mean, it's pirate music. There's not many ways you can do pirate music, excluding Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Fantastic.
For the pirate music, did he use pieces that already existed, or he did everything from scratch?
Pretty sure he did everything from scratch, but of course he probably dragged off other pieces. Like the music, for instance, that one that sounds like Pirates of the Caribbean, he probably used ideas of what Hans Zimmer did for Pirates of the Caribbean.
Now, as I've said before in the past, I love the Future Saga. Listening to the music, comparing tools to A Crack in Time, Boris and Bros did bring some of the elements, but overall, when I compare the two, I feel like I much prefer Bergeaud's work. How would you compare their style to his? Were they inspired? Was there some sort of influence?
Well, Boris was called in for Crack in Time because, of course, David had just sort of left, and Boris obviously is more of a symphonic orchestrator. He's really good with symphonies, like orchestras and stuff. So, Crack in Time was a very cinematic game, and I think that really worked well. It didn't really feel like a Ratchet and Clank score, though. It felt more... I mean, there was elements that did feel Ratchet and Clanky, but for the most part, it didn't really call much to Ratchet and Clank. It felt like its own thing, which is all fine, because like I said, Crack in Time is a cinematic game. Now, moving on, I think a couple of years in, that's when Bros came in, right? He came in 2011 for All for One. Bros introduced continued that orchestral style, but of course brought back some of the more of the electronics that were missing from A Crack in Time. Stuff like bass lines and arpeggios and other stuff, synth leads. And overall it works. It's not the same though.
You told me the other day Bros uses three things: live orchestra, 50 to 60 people, which I found very interesting, software and hardware combined. And
Yes.
talking about Bros, there was an interview on Ratchet Galaxy, which, by the way, Insomniac Games knows about, which is pretty cool. They did have their anniversary some months ago. Was it a couple months ago? I don't remember, but yeah, they did have their 10th anniversary, which is great. So I'll make sure to leave the link in the description below. You were saying something?
More like 6 months.
6 months ago. There you go. All right, let's move on to the fourth point. This is something the community has been concerned about for a very long time. Today's Ratchet and Clank music is so generic, forgettable, not memorable, and pretty much noise in the background. And this noise in the background, a good example, which people have been bringing up a couple of times, and I think you as well, is the PS4 game.
Yes, entirely. In fact, it's not even, a lot of people will blame Bros for the music how it is. And yes, there's some things to blame. I mean, it is his style, it's what he wants to do. But I also kind of blame Insomniac, their mixing engineer, whoever does it, mixes the audio so low that you can't hear anything besides occasional bits of the music because it's all being covered up by atmospheric noise, dialogue, and explosions. It's kind of pushed in the back versus the music of yesteryear games was very in your face, was very, much above all of that. So it's kind of annoying. But the music being generic, I don't necessarily agree. I mean, Insomniac and Sony are clients. And as a member of the industry, you sort of have to satisfy your client. You have to do. And the music, I think John Hogue, one of Bros's additional composers that works with him, mentioned to me that if he had a choice, he would try to make music that's more of what the fans want, which is more of that old David Bergeaud loopy style that we were mentioning before.
So it's ultimately the industry. I think that's why people bring up the term generic. Oh, games get more realistic, so they'll have to change the music and make orchestral.
Yes.
That's why they use that word, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Now, listening to the tracks of the PS4 game, for example, like standalone, without gameplay, you can hear it better. Am I the only one?
I can totally hear it better as well. If you go onto the YouTube links, you can hear the music and it sounds a lot clearer. I mean, it's definitely not as bumping as something of David Bergeaud's tracks, but it's definitely far more hearable as a YouTube video or as a standalone soundtrack than it is within the game where it's mixed down completely low.
So let's get one thing straight. Is it Insomniac Games' fault?
Is it Insomniac Games' fault? I mean, to be honest, like I said back in the day, electronic music, that whole entire electronica scene was very hip. It was cool, popular, it worked. Nowadays in games, despite what people say, orchestration is very popular. It's a very popular thing. And I mean, if they had the technology they had today, back then, they would probably have had orchestral soundtracks back then as well. It's more of an industry fault. One thing I do like about what Ross did with Ratchet & Clank soundtracks is he at least tries to get that David Bergeaud sound. I mean, he's mentioned in that interview, the Ratchet Galaxy interview you brought up.
Yep.
He actually sometimes goes back and listens to some of David's old Ratchet & Clank work to get ideas. And I can totally hear it. I mean, it's not noticeable like Tools of Destruction compared to Ratchet & Clank 1, but you can definitely hear there's an influence. You can definitely hear where he's coming from. That's how it is.
Now, I don't hate the new music, right? But the old music, it did represent the tone and feel of the planets better. And I think
Yes.
a lot of people in the community feel the same way. And I think that's pretty much why I don't want to use the word complain, but they're worried. Like, is this always going to be it? Are they going to leave behind the old style music? But as you said, with the whole industry kind of thing, and Sony's involvement, by the way, I guess it is what it is. Which I'm not completely
I think it'll
against.
eventually come back. It will eventually return back to that. I mean, like every style, synths and stuff they're getting more and more popular. The EDM movement is growing. Sort of hip hop is sort of, as much as people think it's growing, it's starting to fizzle off. EDM is now the new thing. So it's sort of, the whole electronic scene is coming back, and I could see it hitting video games again. So yeah, there's always a chance, but I wouldn't say that it's always going to stay like the same. Things change over the years. I mean, the music of Kraken Time is very different from the music of the Ratchet & Clank PS4.
Oh yes, it is. Like the boss battle between Ratchet and Azimuth. I like that one. Like, I'm a fan of orchestrated music, right? I play Kingdom
Same,
Hearts.
I love that stuff.
Yeah. Now,
It's just when it's overdone.
now let's move on to the last point. Why did David Bergeaud leave as the composer of Ratchet & Clank? Many people bring this up all the time. Reddit, community pages, you name it. Now what I think is this, from what we've been saying in the video, Bergeaud composed a more orchestrated style of music for Tools. He saw the game and told himself, alright, I want to make something new, let's try it. It's not like Sony or Insomniac Games told him, hey, this is more realistic, it's more heavy story driven. It's not like they told him, you gotta do this. It was all Bergeaud's doing. Do you want to add something to that? Do you disagree or agree with what I just said?
I agree with you, because it's like, David sort of made his own decision. And the reason why I sort of left was, I mean, by time 2008, David had been working on Ratchet & Clank for what, 6 years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 6 years of games. And on a combination of 8 games. And during those times, he was like recording around 50 minutes of fully produced music, like every day. For like, 8 games, 6 years of doing the same thing over and over again, you get tired of it and, you want to move on. And I could see that David probably wanted to move on from that.
I completely understand. So guys, I think we can all agree that he moved on. It's not Sony's fault. It's not IG's fault. All right. So JP8K, did you want to add something?
I do want to add, David is now, well, I mean, he's a fantastic individual if you ever get to speak to him.
Yeah.
He's living outside of LA now. He sold his studio, which he had in LA back in like 2010 or 11. That's what he used to, where he scored Ratchet & Clank. And he's been selling off all his gear. But he now performs live world instruments all around the country and around the world.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, fantastic individual. I think there's always a chance that he might come back, but fingers crossed.
Yep.
If not, though, there's always be someone new.
I did watch the live streams from Insomniac Games. James Stevenson said, well, you never know. They don't currently have plans for another Ratchet & Clank game, but obviously, after the sales of the PS4 game, after Spidey, for sure we're going to get another Ratchet & Clank title. Only time will tell. So we're going to have to wait. So guys, be patient. So with that being said, JP8K, thank you so much for being in this video and, taking the time out of your day.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem, it was very fun. So with that being said, guys, do your stuff as usual. Comments, questions, anything, leave them all in the comment section below. And as always, I've been Vivi, he's been JP8K, and that's it, that's all. Thank you for watching.